Hey, German listeners, this is part 2 in which I read some myths in attachment and react to them. My name is Dr. Kirk Honda. I'm a therapist and a professor. The page that I'm reading from is Dr. Pascal Vrticka's page, Associate Professor in Psychology at the University of Essex, United Kingdom. Dr. Pascal Vrticka, his last name is spelled Vrticka. His website is P for Pascal and Vrticka, so pvrticka.com, and I'm looking at the attachment myth-busting page. So let's continue with the myths. And I'll remind everyone, like in the first part of this series of episodes, I'll remind everyone that I will probably be rambling to some extent, so if you're not interested in a somewhat disorganized episode, I wouldn't listen to this. The last episode definitely had rambly bits, so if that frustrates you, maybe skip this one. All right, this next myth that is being debunked by the following statement, which is dads are neither substitute moms nor secondary attachment figures. Yeah, so absolutely agree, and I appreciate this one being in number 3 in that. A lot of people culturally and sometimes in the clinical world will think of moms as the primary parent and that the dads are secondary, or they're there to help, or they're secondary attachment figures, or you'll have cultural or even religious understandings that fathers could never replace a mother, that men don't have the same maternal instincts, and this is all just completely false. We've studied this sort of thing. It's also heteronormative, and it's just nonsensical, and upholds the patriarchy, because men can say, well, I don't have to take care of the kids. I can continue to hold all the reins of power of going to work and da-da-da. And so, it's nonsense, and science doesn't support it. The next myth here, the Triune Brain Model is not a good model to explain the neurobiology of attachment. Yeah, so I talked about the Triune Brain Model years ago. 10, 15 years ago, I made an episode about the book General Theory of Love. And from my memory, it's a book review. And from my memory, I said, I like the book, it's fine, but I don't like it for 2 reasons. One is that it proposes this triune brain model, which is not scientifically accurate, or at least has a lot of reductive problems to it. And they don't acknowledge Bowlby, because the whole book is arguably just reframing attachment theory, and they barely acknowledge, or maybe they don't even mention him or something. I can't remember, but I'm like, and they were using these terms that they were coining as if they were inventing these ideas. You could argue they were riffing on attachment theory and they were adding to the literature, but in proper academic writing, you have to acknowledge at the very least what you're riffing off of and what you're basing your ideas on. No one just invents shit in our, especially at this point. Now, maybe you came up with it independently, but it wouldn't be typical. And even if you did, you would acknowledge. Anyway, so the Triune Brain Model, I don't know if I have time to get into this, but it's this way of modeling the brain, which is that you have your inner brain, which is your reptile brain, I think they might call it, and it's like your amygdala, your animalistic survival, fear, maybe sex is in there, I'm not quite sure. And then you have this second layer, which I'm trying to remember what that one was, and then you have the third layer, triune, 3-layer brain or something. And the top layer is our more human side, our ability to think and plan and regulate and that kind of stuff. And that sometimes, like with the General Theory of Love book, they will frame human experience and dysfunction by using this model. Now, I'll just say that if people adhere to the Triune Brain Model as a scientific fact, then they are not following the science. But if you use it as a metaphor, then it's fine. I will do that occasionally. I don't know how often I do, but I'll sometimes refer to the prefrontal cortex or to executive function as, even I might even just be talking about myself. Like last night I was at this party and I was scared of this person I didn't know very well. And I used my prefrontal cortex to regulate and to check in and make a plan or to figure out how to navigate the situation. But my inner brain, or my amygdala, I might say, or the Triune Brain Model might say, my reptile brain wanted to punch him in the face or run away or something. But my prefrontal cortex said, wait, that's not going to be helpful. So these are inherently flawed ways of framing the brain. We want, not only as clinicians, but also as a society, to reduce the brain to this, left brain, right brain, this kind of stuff. And we just don't have the science to back that up. And the science we do have doesn't seem to back it up, in that when we look at imaging, people vary quite a bit. And we don't even know if our imaging technology is exactly measuring what's happening. You'll hear like, oh, this region of the brain tends to light up when someone's doing this task or whatever. But it varies across people. And what we will see is that there are various centers of the brain that are, quote unquote, lighting up with oxygen. And also, you can have thinking in the brain that doesn't even show up on the functional, MRI, because it might be that certain regions or circuits require minimal oxygen, or the what we're measuring when we're using fMRI. It might need minimal energy to function. Right? It would make sense to me anyway. I'm not a neuroscience. Now, I'm not denying fMRI imaging or science. It's really helped us in a lot of ways to develop ways of understanding the brain, stroke and injury and circuitry and, why we are the way we are. There's a lot of exciting science. But when we talk about my reptile brain was afraid of the guy at the party, and then my prefrontal cortex helped me do this, it's reductive, and people who know the brain will cringe at that and say that doesn't make any sense. That's not true. There's so many little sections of the brain, like these, I can't remember the name, but like cingulates and like little complexes of neurons that are like connectors between, the brain it's not like a computer. It's this mush of evolved mess that adapts. You can have people that have a section of the brain removed, and yet they still function in nearly all the ways that you would think they wouldn't be able to, because that quote unquote section of the brain has been removed. How are they able to do that function if that area of the brain that does that function isn't there anymore? Well, it's messy. We can't reduce it to this mechanistic, bumps on the skull way of measuring things. Now, can we target certain things and find that it might help some people? If someone is having seizures and you measure where that's coming from and you do some sort of surgery or magnet, a treatment that can help that. Yeah, but we're just kind of using a sledgehammer on like a Swiss watch, and sometimes it happens to work and other times it doesn't. I'm being exaggerated. Anyway, the point is that Triune Brain Model, if used as a metaphor, I think is fine. But if you're following it like as if it's an accurate, discrete way of describing the brain, the science just isn't there. Okay, the next statement is, more synchrony is not always better for attachment, development, and maintenance. Okay, if I'm going to get through this, I'm going to have to... so I'll recommend reading this. So again, the URL is pvrtica.com, Vrticka.com, and then go to the attachment myth busting page. So synchrony has to do with both the active and unconscious ways in which we will sync up behaviors and biological processes to each other, like heartbeat or tone of voice or eye contact or the way we walk or move or something. Again, sometimes it's conscious, so you're doing it volitionally. Sometimes we just naturally sync up with each other when we're paying attention or we're afraid or whatever. It's very different. We're humans. And we have other ways of measuring this, like if you measure certain hormones or neurotransmitters, sometimes those will also kind of correlate to some extent. And when it comes to parenting, so if we just read this paragraph, synchrony is defined as the coordination of biobehavioral processes during and shortly after social contact. It unfolds in our behavior, like eye gaze, vocalizations, touch. It unfolds in physiology, like heart rate. It unfolds in endocrinology, like secretion of hormones like oxytocin and cortisol, and brain activity. Synchrony is particularly important for parent-infant bond, where it shapes infants' attachment through repeated and contingent interactions with their caregivers. So, just chiming in, synchrony is something that we found to be important in syncing up and bonding. And, in some ways, we wonder if music has, or maybe emerged from this, the synchrony of beat and of dance and of singing and of harmony. There's waves and rhythms and the bass feeling of a drum on our heartbeat. There's a lot of research around this, and brain waves and now some people will take this way too far, and it can get real nonsensical and very woo-woo, and alternative sciencey, or alternative medicine-y, but yeah, there's some real science around that kind of stuff. It's just depending on how you look at it. But anyway, so then going on, social allostasis is emphasized as one of the key processes that links synchrony with attachment. Okay, just chiming in. So I will talk about homeostasis. I don't talk about allostasis very often, but essentially, in a nutshell, what I will say is that social allostasis has to do with, if we think about attachment between parent and child, you have two people that are entering into a system together of behavior and emotion and experience and memory and bond, and over time, and you have outside influences like other people in the family, or stress or lack of stress, or war-torn areas or peaceful areas or whatever, or sickness, viruses or whatever. And the two-person system, if we just reduce it to that, there is a way in which the two individuals will the relationship and the individuals will regulate so that there's some stability, and over time, predictability, and also just not asking the organisms involved, the two people, and the social system to constantly have to adjust and evolve. So and organisms and systems and humans and political systems and, the solar system tends to work better when there's some stability with flexibility to adjustment. So when it comes to homeostasis, you'll hear me use that term, only when I'm talking about homeostasis of social systems, of families and stuff. But with allostasis, boy, I'm kind of getting into the weeds. But the idea is that we want to focus on, and it's really hard to lock this down on the individual level or even on the global level, but that if we even just look at one relationship between a parent and a child, we're looking at how the two individuals adjust to themselves, to each other, to the world, how things change over time, because you have the child that's developing, they're getting bigger, they're changing in terms of their impulses, their intelligence, their social ability, when a child is 1 versus a child is 7 versus a child is 18. And this bond and the stability over time and the ability to predict what's going to happen the next day while adjusting, while being able to be flexible. All this is what we're talking about. And it has to do with biology as well. There's some things we can say about biology and measuring that, and, heart rate and cortisol and oxytocin and eye gaze and the way you talk to each other, the way you cuddle, the way that you allow space. There's a system there. There's a predictability. There's an adjustment. A lot of it's unconscious. Some of it's conscious. Anyway, so what is he getting at here? More synchrony is not right. So what I think the myth that he's trying to dispel here is that all of this science will get reduced to a TikTok video where they're saying, in order to create secure, attached children, healthy kids, good kids, you have to be in synchrony with your child. You have to sync up with their tone of voice, with their rhythms, and mirror neurons get pulled into here. Bullshit neuroscience gets pulled in here, or an energy kind of religion, supernatural rhythms of, quantum. You'll hear all sorts of bullshit. And what they're doing is they're taking the science around synchrony and the science around mirror neurons, the science around neuroscience, the science around social allostasis, and they're making a little TikTok video and they don't know what they're saying, and they're being too reductive, and they're being too simplistic, and they're just saying, and you'll see these tips on TikTok where people will say, if you want someone to like you, you have to match their rhythms. And if they're talking slow, you want to talk slow. If they're talking fast, you want to talk fast. If they're using a certain language system, you want to use that. Now, yeah, is that something to think about if you're having trouble? Yeah. Therapists are told this explicitly, that if a client is, you want to meet the client where they're at. Now, not always, because there are situations where you don't necessarily want to do that, and also you don't necessarily want the client to dictate that. You don't want the client to be stuck in that, or it depends on what the goal is, the situation, what's happening. But yeah, I'm guessing. So let's read this. During social allostasis, caregivers act as external co-regulators of infants' physiology. For this to work efficiently and successfully, there needs to be a good biobehavioral matching between parent and child, which reflects high parental sensitivity to attunement of the infant. Yeah. Unsurprisingly, differences in social allostasis, availability, and quality predict infant emotional, cognitive, and brain development, and likely explain how individual differences in attachment emerge and are neurobiologically embedded across lifespan. So this gets at something that I talk about, at least I'm pretty sure it's getting at something I talk about, something I don't use this terminology, but that you can have a parent who, let's just reduce it to just a single parent, and the other parent has never been around. So it's a clean scenario where you just have one caregiver and you have 3 kids, and the parents all 3 kids generally the same way. And the 3 kids grow up to have different attachment styles, or different, one has borderline and the other 2 don't. And you're thinking, what happened there? Well, it has to do with this social, the pattern that was developed. And we could talk about allostasis, we could talk about homeostasis, we could talk about, I guess we could talk about synchrony. And but the way that you'll hear me or Bob, the way that we will frame it is the match, the way in which the parent, comes together with that child, and also how that develops. What's the pattern that develops between those 2 people in relation to their personality, and also what's happening around them, their experiences, their beliefs about things. And so all of that is true, and brain development is affected by that. So it's not all just like social decisions or schemas. It's, it literally affects the way that the child develops and the circuitries that are developed and what wires together, fires together. Anyway. All right, let's take a break here first. There's actually a really powerful scene in a movie that I've never seen in any other context that is along these lines. It's the movie Midsummer with Florence Pugh. There's this scene, and it's not spoiling anything to say this, but Florence Pugh, her and some friends, they go to this Swedish, I think, resort in the summer to celebrate this we would call it, I guess, a cult, but you could also just call it like a commune or a group or something. And the Florence Pugh, I can't remember her character's name, but she's dealing with her own kind of traumas and her own current difficulties in her relationship with her boyfriend. And there's this moment where she's really hurt and kind of freaking out. And she starts to cry, and a bunch of other young women her age, Florence Pugh's age, notice that she's upset and run to her. So like 7 of these young women run to Florence Pugh, and they don't hug her necessarily or comfort her. They mirror her. And so as she is wailing and crying and bending over and wiping her eyes, the women are doing the exact same thing. They're breathing the same as she is. And they're all around her, and as she leans over, they lean over. As she makes a face, they make the same face. And it's not mocking. It's a powerful scene. And I even watched a little documentary or featurette about her talking about how the actress talking about this scene and just how hard it was and how intense it was, but how fulfilling it was and how bonding it was. Okay. And now relationships and bonding, if this is all that you did, like with your, 2-year-old child, if you just mirrored exactly what they did at all times, that's not the road to wellness for anyone. But it is something to think about. Now, when we're properly attuned and we care and love our children, we tend to sync up, and they tend to sync up with us, right? If they are freaking out about a dog that they're not familiar with, but you're totally not afraid of the dog because you know the dog, or the dog's on a leash or whatever, your child will sync with you. You know what I mean? And that's an important function of parenting and of co-regulation. And that's not only true for us humans, but it's true for a lot of animals and organisms. So, I think this is what, then going on. Thus, there is an optimal mid-range of synchrony with both too little and too much synchrony likely being linked to an interaction, relationship, and attachment difficulties. Accordingly, we recently found increased parent-child brain-to-brain synchrony not only for dyads with securely attached daughters, but also for dyads with securely attached mothers. Securely attached daughters, brain synchrony, dyads with securely attached, but also dyads with dyads of insecurely attached mothers. More research is needed to further elucidate the blah blah blah. So it's an interesting area of science and philosophy. Like the notion of allostasis and homeostasis and systems theory. A lot of these things can't really be measured precisely, and they're concepts of feedback and of development and of stability and of optimizing input versus output, optimizing survivability, or whatever it is that you're, like with a solar system, one could say, especially if you're Earth and human centered, is that if there's stability in the solar system, meaning that the orbits and the way things wobble around, because it's not a simple system, and when you look at the diagrams, you just see circles around the sun, but none of them are circles. They're all ellipses, and they're all off kilter, and there's wobble and there's pull and push, and it's not 100% stable. Now, in the short term, it tends to be, but in the long term, not so much. If you know about the 3-body problem, or if you're talking about a several body problem. Anyway, so we tend to put a value on stability in our solar system, because if things get pulled one way or the other, we as the Earth can get flung out into the darkness and the coldness of space, or we can get flung close to the Earth and we burn up, or we have an overly elliptical orbit, and for a portion of a year we're like baking in the sun, and for the other portion we're languishing at the distance of like Mars or something with no heat and not enough energy and stuff. And so, we tend to value stability. But if we use the solar system as an example, if we had a new, planet, or in the beginning of our solar system development, if the theory of our moon is that we had a Mars-sized planet that collided with Earth, and then the ejecta formed the moon, and that was an introduction of this new thing. And so we want to develop a new stable system that incorporates the moon now, because we didn't have the moon before. So we have to be able to adjust, right? We can't just act like we would normally if we're trying to establish, if we talk about human systems, like you have a new child that enters the family, or you have divorce, or you have a child that is now an adolescent. How do you develop a new allostasis? How do you, and how do we observe that? We can't know, right? We only have the ability to, in a very rudimentary way, measure some things about humans in the lab, but we're not going to do that for all of our kids all the time and ourselves. So we just have to use these principles to frame things. And as a therapist, it's very helpful when we understand these ideas, because we zoom out instead of saying, well, the mom's to blame because she's too strict. Well, maybe, but in all likelihood, it's more useful to zoom out, look at the bigger picture, and even think about the biology of the two, or make some guesses about the biology, and you might make some inferences based on the way they're talking to each other in session, or how in tune they are, how attuned are they, how rejecting, how upset, how, if the kid gets stressed out at school, how does the parent co-regulate? If it helps to think neurobiologically and endocrinology wise, then if the outcome is a good outcome, then fine. But sometimes, especially online, people will say like, take this supplement and your kid will be fine with their thing. And, because they're pulling, anyway, let's move on to another myth here. I can't imagine what y'all are thinking of me in this episode, because I'm just skimming the surface. And I'm not an expert on it. So if you are an expert on it, you're probably just like, that sentence was wrong, which, I would be fine with if you were sitting here and you're like, oh, no. I'm fine with that. To me, I used to think about neurobiology and, brain science as something that was extremely foreign to me and incomprehensible. But with the topics that I am concerned with as a clinician and as a human, like attachment theory, when I talk to experts in brain science, what I will find, and I've even had guests on the podcast where this will be discovered real time, is that their neuroscience is proving or supportive of the model that I utilize. It's not just my model, right? It's a model of attachment and relationships that was developed by John Bowlby and others. You could say Freud and a lot of others. It's my way of combining all those things, but it's not unique really. And when I hear experts talk about what they have discovered, new discoveries of just, whether it's this sort of synchrony or allostasis, or of, I don't know, the mirror neurons, or of stress in the brain, of attachment, memory, all that area. There's a lot of areas. When they consolidate it as an expert and tell me what they're finding, it is supporting very much so the way that I see humans and attachment. And so what I have concluded over the years, at least with current neuroscience up until this point, maybe it'll be different in the future, is that it's just two different ways of describing the same thing. And they're mutually supportive of each other. You know what I mean? If that makes sense. Going on. This next statement, number 6 out of 34. Oxytocin is not the bonding or love hormone. The story is much more complicated than that. Yeah. So you'll hear that. And I don't tend to use this language because it's not my area. I'm not a biologist. I'm not a neuroscientist. And I also know enough about these things to know that, these reductive ways of seeing the function of oxytocin in the brain or the body, to just say it's like the love hormone or the bonding hormone is really silly. Plus, it illuminates this tendency that we have when viewing the brain of just like, oh, serotonin makes you happy. Oh, okay. Well, I just need more serotonin. And you'll see people do this. They'll say like, hey, have you been down lately? Well, you need to increase serotonin, right? So if you take this supplement that has serotonin, you'll be fine. And, I won't go into the biology of like enzymes and the way your body processes things and how serotonin plays a myriad of functions through the body. That if you just like blasted your body with serotonin, like some really horrible things can happen. And maybe one of the things that happens to your body is you're maybe a little happier, but maybe not, you know what I mean? Anyway, so to say that oxytocin is like the bonding or love hormone is a little silly. Now, do we have research that will inject oxytocin into people and we will see different results like increase of love or bonding? Or when we measure people in two scenarios, whether they're bonding or they're not, and is there increase in oxytocin in general? Yeah, but the way that neurons work and neurotransmitters and hormones, and it's just, it's even of what we understand is way more complicated than that. And two, we also have to acknowledge we just don't really understand how things work because it's a messy system, the brain and the neurons in the body. But anyway, so let's see, reading this part. The main problem with the bonding or love hormone account of oxytocin function is an overemphasis on its pro-social and relationship-promoting effects, which goes back to a 2005 study in humans that reported increased trust after a single dose of oxytocin given by nasal spray. Many subsequent studies using a similar procedure were inconclusive and failed to show the same results, what is more, many studies found oxytocin to actually have negative effects. For example, oxytocin nasal spray administration increased dishonesty and lying, increased the inclination for aggression, and made more anxiously attached participants remember their mother as less caring and close. That's interesting. I don't think I knew that research. I'm learning from Dr. Pascal Vrticka here. A better way to conceptualize oxytocin's function is to think of it as regulating the saliency of many different cues. That's interesting. So it is regulating how to take notice or how to encode or how to pay attention to relationships or bonding or something like that, whether it's positive, negative, or not. So it's interesting. Yeah. And they find that a similar finding when it comes to serotonin, that serotonin doesn't make you happier. There's some evidence that serotonin, and again, there's so many functions of serotonin throughout the body, including like your digestion. There's brain gut axis and stuff. And I'll mention also that there's a lot of TikTok, Instagram bullshit around the gut brain axis that you'll see, around there's just so much bullshit out there. They'll take a little bit of science and then they'll try to expand it into a snappy TikTok video, or they're trying to sell you some bullshit. But anyway, there's science that, at least last I studied it, that with serotonin, the reason why SSRIs work is because it unlocks or helps the brain to learn something new. The idea goes is that when you have depression, you're not responding to new inputs of positive thinking or life circumstances or whatever. And so this demoralization, shutdown mode is chronic, and maybe it was functional or normal in a temporary state to respond to something, but it became entrenched. And so no amount of talk or of positive thinking or getting off your feet and moving through the world can dislodge your brain from this notion that life is hopeless and pointless and you're worthless or whatever. And the oxytocin, what it doesn't make you happier. What it does is it the extra serotonin that is being uptaken by other neurons, that's how it works, SSRIs anyway, that your brain is now open to changing and shifting. And with that, if you have therapy and you work on things, because that, this is why we find that SSRIs alone don't tend to work very well. This is why SSRIs with therapy tends to help, because and why with treatment-resistant depression, if you just have therapy, it's not as good as if you have SSRIs as well, in general, on average. And so the idea goes is that serotonin doesn't make you happier. It just has some function regarding ruts and change and new perspectives and new allostasis, new ways of a new stability, if that makes any sense, in the brain. Anyway, experts in this area are cringing at every word I say, but all right, let's go to this one. Polyvagal theory. So Dr. Pascal is saying this statement to dispel an unstated myth. Polyvagal theory is not supported by current physiological literature. This has important implications for our understanding of attachment trauma. Yeah, so I've talked about this before because I get a lot of questions on this, and I don't think I'll ever do a deep dive on it because, I don't know, maybe one day, but in terms of priorities. But 20 years ago, polyvagal theory started to become popular in my field. And I think now it's sort of popular in pockets on the internet among lay people. And I've said this before, but basically there is science around the nervous system that have been found. And I think it's just one popular writer, I'm not sure, and that someone reported on the science that was sound, but then expanded on it to help us understand trauma and relationships and attunement and attachment theory and stuff. And they were stretching it. And maybe when they first developed it, it was just speculation, but over time, people just started to gravitate around it. Now, why were they gravitating around it and defending it, even though scientists were saying, wait a second, that's not scientific what you're saying about the nervous system? Well, it's because when you have trauma or difficulty, or you have personality disorder, or you have trouble with regulation, or you have a lot of distress in your life, then it can help to have some way of modeling it, understanding it, right? And, for us humans, we have a tendency, particularly in the United States, maybe around the world, but I can just speak for mainstream society in the United States, we tend to really want concrete explanations, like the polyvagus nerve is this and that. We want oxytocin, as opposed to experts saying, we don't know why this happens, or we have some guesses, but people don't like that. They want certainty. They want concreteness. And so there's a lot of people that are desperate for good reason, and a charismatic writer comes along and explains, and it works is the thing. Like if let's say that someone comes along and says, the reason why you are having so much trouble in relationships and you're in so much stress and you hate yourself is because aliens have been downloading images into your brain, or they've been anally probing you in the middle of the night. And they've been injecting you with this negativity. Okay, so this is nonsense. But let's say that the charismatic leader says, and therefore, what you need to do is you need to get better sleep. You need to eat better. You need to go to therapy and talk about your childhood. You need to start looking at the way you see the world, the automatic thoughts you have. You have to hug people more. You have to have secure relationships. Okay, so let's say that in that very silly example, you're like, well, that could work, The reason, so if you have a group of people that will only respond to explanations related to alien butt probing, then you've succeeded in helping people. We would ask, doesn't matter if they just made that up, if it's helping to motivate people to take care of themselves, in the absence of a more any other concrete explanation. What would we say? Well, I don't know. I would hope that we could educate the public that the solution is a solution and not the theory that this person is promoting. Polyvagal theory is kind of along those lines. There's a lot of other theories. You could argue all sorts of things, religion, even forms of therapy. You could argue have this hand-wavy explanation, but in the end, it's actually helping people because it's doing the right thing. You could argue that psychoanalysis was this whole thing in that they developed this system, Freud and others, that through free association and the archaeological dig of the mind, that it was that alone that was curing people of their, what we today would call anxiety, depression, PTSD, relationship worries. But through our lens today, we would say, no, you weren't, it didn't have anything to do with unearthing unconscious, Oedipal complexes to kill their mom or kill their dad and have sex with their mom. No. You were, what you were doing is you were listening to people. People were coming into your office and were given permission to talk about whatever they wanted to without any stigma, without anyone else knowing what you were saying, what they were saying, and you listened. And Freud, you don't know this because you didn't see it this way at the time, but you had a lot of empathy. And you paid attention, and you remembered, and you cared, and you had warmth, and you noticed, you saw people, and that's what helped them. It was the relationship. It was this humanistic theory of person-centered, of phenomenology, of attunement. That's the way we would see it today. So is it a scientific fact that attunement and warmth and empathy helps clients? Well, research tends to go in that direction, but how do we scientifically observe empathy, right? Even if we codify it in certain ways, it could become wooden, right? If someone's like, okay, this is what you say to be empathetic, how do you know? So, a lot of empathy in reality occurs between humans in a extremely subtle context, personality-based manner. I often will, not often, but sometimes I will marvel at, as a therapist myself, when I am believing myself to be conveying a lot of empathy, and there's a lot of evidence that the client is receiving it. If you were watching the two of us from the outside, you wouldn't see me doing anything different, but I feel it. It's in the way that I'm paying attention, the way I'm listening, my facial expression, the way the client is vibing with me. You can't measure that, but I could also just be making shit up. I could just be doing a version of alien butt probing. I'm just saying a story because it fits with my worldview, because that's the culture I emerge out of. So anyway, polyvagal theory is that. Now, does polyvagal theory pan out on some claims? Seemingly yes, but on a lot of it, no. But if it helps someone, like if I met someone or even someone close to me, and I've had this happen, where they're really adhering to the theory, and I notice that they're actually just using it as a motivator to do a lot of good things. And they're also released, because that's the other thing, is that this theory, for a lot of people, it releases them from the stigma that society will heap upon them and say, no, it's this thing about my nervous system, and I'm normal when I wake up on the wrong side of the bed, and there's a reason why I get hostile at work, Now, the theory or the proponents of it, at least the ones that are doing it well, they wouldn't say, and therefore you're released of responsibility and feel free to like be a dick to everyone around you. No, what they say is like, something's going on with you, and you now have a way of framing it that isn't saying it's something wrong with your soul. There's something wonky about your nervous system, maybe one particular nerve, and here's the solution. Regulation of your emotions, self-awareness, self-compassion, deep breathing, taking a break, hugging your cat, so the solution ends up being, a lot of us can get behind that regardless of how you got there. Anyway, I'm just going to read and say one sentence the rest of these. Okay. There is no specific parenting hacks that work for everyone, and no specific parenting hacks that always lead to secure child attachment development. Yeah. I mean, if you listen to anything I say about parenting, you'll hear me say that. I learned this the hard way with parents as clients, that I would frequently have to say, because parents would come to me with very different parenting styles. Sometimes one or both of them would be outside the bounds of what I would consider to be good parenting or passable parenting or healthy parenting. But sometimes they would both be within the bounds of healthy parenting, but just at different parts of the dot matrix plot. And I would tell them that you're both right. And there's this notion in our society and among couples that I know what I'm doing is good, and therefore what you're doing is bad. When it's like you both are doing good parenting. And if you just chose one of them or lived with the fact that you have differences or compromised on certain things, you'd be fine. You don't have to, neither one of you is, anyway. Attachment is not right brain. Oh, the other thing that I'll say about the parenting thing is there's a lot of ways to parent happy kids. I was talking with some people about like the way sports are for kids today, which I find to be extremely foreign. As a kid, as a person that grew up with a lot of sports, everyone around me plays sports. My family was a very sports-oriented family. All my cousins, my parents, my grandparents, everyone was just like sports. And the way that sports are done today is just, it's a lot more involved, and there's a lot more pressure. I'll say I was talking with my family, and my mom gave this analogy that I was like, oh yeah, she's like, yeah, back in the day, it was like gymnastics that you would hear that would consume a young person's life. And now it's just like that way with soccer and basketball and football and wrestling. And every sport is like gymnastics, where you're doing it year round, and you have personal trainers, and and is it a good thing or a bad thing? There's pros and cons. And so I didn't say this, but what I was thinking, and I've thought this before, that although I can point to a lot of downsides to the current way parents parent kids around this, and it's not even just sports, it's like dance or art or whatever, like it's way more involved. Now, on the other hand, kids are getting a lot more attention from their parents, and they're given a lot more opportunity to spread their wings, and like with an elite or select soccer team at the age of 12, you're bonding with your teammates in a big way. You're getting a lot of self-esteem from being out in the field, but there's a downside, which is that it can be a lot of pressure. It can lock kids in too much. It can restrict freedom of creative boredom, space. Anyway, and what I was thinking in my head was, well, there's a lot of ways to raise happy kids. One is the Gen X way, in which we're just left on our own for the most part. And then you have the kids of today, Gen Alpha, that are very helicopter parented and are scheduled, from morning till night. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but you know what I mean. And rarely have, the freedom to just do whatever they want, leave the house. And, and I know enough to know that both environments can produce happy, fulfilled people. And it just kind of depends on how it's navigated. Depends on how are people reacting to the kids. Anyway. This next one, attachment is not right brain centered. There is no right brain versus left brain lateralization for complex behaviors and personality traits. Yeah, I hope I don't have to go over that. I've talked about that before. The right brain, left brain thing is just a ball of nonsense. It's based on this really, I can't remember what it's based on, but it might even be based on a misunderstanding of someone that said something. I don't know, but it's nonsense, utter nonsense. Now, can you say certain things about left and right brain areas, like with language or with, movements and da-da-da-da? Yeah, but this, what you hear people literally say is they'll be, oh my God, I'm so left brain. And you're saying, no, you're not. You're just telling yourself a story. Now, if people understand that they're just telling a story and it's just a way of talking about things, then fine. But understand that it's not science. All right, well, let's take a break. Attachment involves much more than just threat and fear, and its neurobiological basis extends far beyond the amygdala and the HPA stress axis. Right, HPA. So HPA is the hypothalamus, adrenal, anyway. So essentially the parts of the brain associated with fear and stress and trauma and threat. And so attachment involves much more than, So I hope that I don't come across this way, that attachment, there are times when I might even word it this way, but that attachment theory or the attachment function or the attachment reality of humans sometimes is framed as a way of coping with threat and fear of the unknown or fear of abandonment, fear of being alone in the wilderness. And that attachment is a way of, heading that off at the pass. And there are times when I might kind of reduce it to that to try to explain the evolutionary speculation around why we have attachment behaviors and impulses and that sort of thing. But yeah, and especially if we start reducing it to the HPA stress and the amygdala, we're getting into some of that anal probe territory. Next statement. Why is it important to say parent-child bonding and not parent-child attachment? So that's not a statement. That's just a question. Yeah, I won't get into the weeds on that, but it's just, it's important to understand how we might define bonding versus attachment. Certainly they're used, generally speaking, in a very different way in the clinical literature among lay people and among clinicians that are just talking to clients. They won't necessarily use those technical terms, but yeah. As parents, we don't need to be consistently present and always on. It suffices to be good enough. Right. So what this is getting at, which I think most people understand, is that to raise happy kids, if we understand our goal, that's usually what it is, happy, healthy kids, relatively happy, relatively healthy. We don't have to be constantly perfect and attuned and, with them all the time. You just have to be good enough. And we have this term from Donald Winnicott from many years ago. Pretty sure Winnicott. Anyway. So it's not possible to be perfect. Plus, if you strive for that, you could end up getting burnt out or resentful or not meeting your own needs. Another statement. Attachment parenting is not based on attachment theory, and there is little scientific evidence that it yields secure attachment. So I've done a whole episode on attachment parenting from way back in the day. So if you just search for that, pretty sure it might be the title anyway. And I'm pretty sure it's still up as a rerun or something. But yeah, so attachment parenting is a complicated thing. So on one hand, what I'll say about attachment parenting is that it's a conglomeration of it's sort of a grassroots movement in a lot of ways. And it's a good movement in that it acknowledges, of the various different parenting styles or parenting movements, it's based on attachment theory and attunement. And what it does is it frees up parents to move away from the cultural stigma that we still have around avoiding creating kids that are too dependent on their parents. For example, for a lot of parents, they are told or believe that they have to make sure that the child is in a crib on their own at the age of like 5 or 6 months or something. And they will focus on that at the expense of everything else, because they don't want to create a child that's overly dependent on their parents. And now what I'll say is that, going through a phase where you're helping your kid to adjust to living, to sleeping in a crib in another room, even at the age of 6 months, it's not a bad thing. It's not inherently harmful. It's way more complicated than that. Case by case, there's pros and cons. There's also, how do you do it exactly? Some kids, they just, fall asleep instantly, and when they wake up, they're in a relatively good mood, and they call out to you, and you're right there, and in the other room, and you come to them anyway. So, and then that's very different than a kid that's like terrified of being on their own, and you like force them in a crib, and when they call out, you like don't go to them, and there's no transition period, and it's too young. There's just a lot of differences. But the attachment parenting movement was like, attachment is the focus, and we need to not pay attention to the cultural stigma and the Victorian notions of if you listen to my deep dive on attachment theory, you've heard me talk about John Bowlby and how our whole science and understanding of attachment theory likely emerged from an individual who was heavily neglected growing up, and he knew what that felt like, John Bowlby, to be neglected and abandoned as a child, even though his parents lived with him. But this Victorian notion of the elite and the aristocracy, it was below them to take care of their kids, so they had nannies, and the nannies would come and go, and so you have John Bowlby that just has all these attachment injuries and disruptions and abandonment, and likely had a lot of symptoms as an adult, and proceeded to do a lot of research around this and said, no, actually, it's harmful to kids. You think you're helping the kid by making them independent, but what you're doing is you're forcing them to turn away from their natural instinct of attachment, and they're crying and giving up, and that's not a lesson you want to teach a child. They're going to grow up to be depressed and anxious and weird in relationships and overly preoccupied or overly avoidant or something. And so attachment parenting movement comes along and says, hey, there's this thing called attachment theory, and we're focusing on attachment. And with attachment, when you create a secure base for a child, they will not become overly dependent on you, because children have a natural tendency to want to venture away from you, but only if they feel like you are a secure base. The analogy is, you go to a park and you have a 4-year-old kid, and the kid, let's say securely attached, doesn't want to go out on the playground with all these weird kids that don't know, and they cling to you. But there's a part of them that really wants to go on that playground and move away from you, to be independent, to have fun, that freedom, But they need to cling to you at the initial phase of entering the park. And maybe the initial phase is like the first time you go there. Maybe you go there for an hour and the kid doesn't want to venture off. But eventually you don't have to force kids to move away from you. If you create a secure base and you're available and you're attuned and you're there and you're not pushing them out of the nest, they will naturally want to fly, but only if they know that you are securely there for them in a relatively good enough way. And so attachment parenting, starts over from scratch, and in terms of how do we understand parenting and how to raise healthy, happy, independent kids. And so if that means breastfeeding beyond what is considered socially acceptable, then that's what it means, and it's okay, right? And so it's a good movement. However, there's a lot of disparate people in this movement. There's authors that will go too far with it. there are people that will make these really rigid claims, like in another way, because you would say that the Victorian neglecting way of parenting is too rigid and it's based on nonsense. You could have people that are attached to attachment theory and will develop these philosophies and systems of parenting that are also too rigid. Like if you put your kid into daycare at the age of 9 months, then you're automatically creating a fucked up kid, which is not true. Science doesn't find that to be true at all. It depends, it depends on how it's managed. It depends on the parents. It depends on the caregiver, the daycare. It depends on the kid itself. So there's just a lot of different variables. There are general guidelines like don't beat your kids and, try to help them when they're distressed. But anyway, this episode's going on too long. But yeah, so let's read this. Contrary to what its name suggests, attachment parenting is not based on attachment theory. Now, chiming in for myself, when I might use the term attachment parenting, but I'm not referring to the formalized attachment parenting movement. I might just be talking about parenting in an attachment-informed way. Anyway, parenting advice building on evidence-based knowledge from extended research that keeps informing attachment theory should thus not be confused with recommendations from attachment parenting or similar other intensive parenting movements. Yeah, so I think this is looking at maybe the more prominent or obvious figures in attachment parenting that will be very rigid in their recommendations that you sleep with your kid until the kid is, a lot older than typical. Like, maybe they're 7 years old and they're still sleeping in the bed with the parents. Maybe that's taken a little far, but something like that. And they'll say if you transition the kid to their own room when they're 2 years old, then you're following the culture of nastiness when it comes to parenting, and you're not going to raise an attachment secure kid. Or breastfeeding, cutoff dates can also be rigidly followed. So now the problem that attachment parenting was trying to address is the prolific understandings of parenting that were present in the 70s, 80s, and 90s that needed to be eliminated. There were a lot of problematic parenting practices, there's a lot of P's. There were a lot of problematic parenting practices and assumptions that were harming kids and were locking parents into a way of parenting that they didn't even want to do, And so attachment parenting comes along, and there were other movements as well that were saying, no, that's all. A lot of that is wrong. And so we have this other way. And what can happen is that there's this new movement and it's fledgling, and there will be a lot of people within the culture that will say, well, you're just going to raise kids that are too dependent. And then the attachment parenting people would say, no, that's actually not true. It's not true anecdotally. It's not true scientifically. And what can happen, though, is that because of this fighting that will go back and forth, particularly if you're a smaller minority group, as attachment parenting tends to be, then you end up digging in and you end up becoming dogmatic because you just are done arguing with idiots, And then when someone comes along and says nuanced pushback, then the dogma will kick in. There's a very similar thing when it comes to AA and 12-step groups, that when it comes to Alcoholics Anonymous as a treatment option, that you'll have people that are struggling with alcohol use, and they will enter the program, and there will be this thought in their head of, well, I don't really need to abstain completely. I mean, can't I just drink casually? And then they will drink, they'll start playing around with the edges of the recommendations from their fellow people at AA, and they will, they'll have a couple beers at a party or something, and things don't go badly, but it opens the door. Next week, it's 6 beers. And then a month later, it's 10 beers. And then a month later, they're drinking every day. And then their life becomes unmanageable. And then they have a problem with alcohol again, and they go back to 12-step group. And everyone around them has also gone down that road. And what they will say is, abstinence is the only answer. You can't drink. You have a disease, right? And with a lot of people, they will find that that is true. And so someone comes along with a nuanced take and says, actually, that's not true scientifically for everyone. There are plenty of people who can recover from what in Alcoholics Anonymous you call an alcoholic problem, and can navigate toward a lifestyle where they do drink casually and it doesn't become a problem. And the 12-step people, the dogmatic people, will say, we've been down this road for decades. Among people in our group, they would even say themselves, I went down that road too. That's just an excuse. But so they're fighting with themselves. They're fighting with people from the outside, just saying, why is abstinence? Why do you have to have abstinence? Well, the fact is that it seems for people without, this is me talking, with alcohol problems, that some people need to abstain. There's given experience with a lot of experiments that they've tried, that any amount of alcohol, even if they just think that it's okay for them to drink alcohol, even if they don't drink alcohol, even if they just allow the idea that maybe it's okay that they drink alcohol, that is the first step on a slippery slope for their life to completely become horrible, right? Other people are different though. So for for a lot of people who struggle with addiction or alcohol use, substance use problems, for a lot of those people that probably need to abstain completely, they will play around the edges and will find out, they'll fuck around and find out, so to speak, and find out that notion of, harm reduction is this area of research and of recommendation and of alcohol treatment, that the harm reduction model actually is not going to work for them. And so how do you differentiate when you're trying to help someone, not die tomorrow in some horrible, side effect from drinking, drinking too much or drugging too much or a car accident or other consequences like losing their job, or, if you have someone that has an obvious history of a problem with a substance and they're asking themselves or asking you, I want to use, but is it possible that I use casually? Like, is that an option? I see other people doing it. Is it viable for me? Well, the safe answer is no, it's not. The safe answer is abstinence is the way. But for other people, not only is it potentially viable that they could return, could develop a lifestyle where they do occasionally use or use within moderation, and it would be sustainable. But also for some people, it could be argued that occasional use is the optimal way to live because the abstinence lifestyle might actually not be conducive, depending on how you look at it, right? I know people don't usually like to talk about that drugs can enhance one's life if used responsibly. But, it kind of depends on what you privilege, But at the very least, there are plenty of people that the harm reduction model works for. So how do you differentiate, right? And are you just giving an excuse for people to use and relapse and harm themselves and everyone around them? Especially imagine if you have a spouse that you're just like, you would rather them just abstain. Why experiment with harm reduction and occasional use? So, so people can dig in. And so with the attachment parenting people, I think they started to dig in, unfortunately. And it was a good movement from my anecdotal experience that had a lot of, in some ways, we could even say that the attachment parenting movement kind of, the principles became mainstream so much that we don't need the attachment parenting movement anymore, if that makes sense. Anyway, it's complicated. There's a lot of history. There's a lot of people, and especially if you've been around or involved in these circles, there's a lot we could say. There's problematic people all over the place. There's a lot of judgment around parents, and as I was saying before, there's a lot of ways to raise happy kids, and you'll have people that'll be like, wait, you're breastfeeding your kid at 6 years old? That's disgusting. You're sexually abusing your kid. And it's like, well, maybe, but certainly not necessarily. And just show me the data, right? Is breastfeeding your kid at the age, and it's not breastfeeding, right? It's not like they're getting their daily sustenance the way that an infant would. It's a bonding experience, and it's fine. I'm telling you. Now, culturally speaking, if I saw a 6-year-old, and I've seen it, breastfeeding, it would shock me. It does shock me. I'm like, ugh, it's culturally disgusting. It is sexual abusive to me. Not to me, but it looks that way. It looks like sexual abuse is happening or something, or horrible, some incest, or at the very least, infantilization in a harmful, abusive way. But that's not what's happening. When we look at the research, when we longitude, especially when we look at other cultures around the world and over time, there's a wide variety of options here. And now to not do that, say you wean early or you always bottle feed or something, then that's fine too. There's a lot of ways, it just depends, right? And there's just a lot of ways to raise kids. Some kids are different, and some dyads are different, right? The key is that we understand the principles of attachment and attunement and use those to inform the overall approach to parenting within your culture, within your comfort level, within the bounds of the child's disposition. There's just a lot. Anyway, blar. This next thing is just saying there's a lot of different measures on attachment. Yeah. Insecure, disorganized, and unresolved attachments are not clinical diagnoses. Yeah. Social neuroscience data is vital to fully understand human attachment. Yeah. Attachment styles are not like horoscopes. Yeah. Attending nursery daycare doesn't harm your child attachment. Yep. Neurodivergent children, including those with autism, can and do form secure attachment bonds, of course. Oh my God. Yeah. I feel like that one's, to me, that myth was around 10, 20 years ago, that autistic kids don't bond or don't have attachment, and I don't think many people believe that anymore, at least in my circle. Attachment styles are not set in stone. Yeah. Attachment and infant crying. Is it true that babies cannot be spoiled, or should parents leave their babies to cry it out in bed? It's way more complicated than that. I've already kind of blabbed about that. Do we inherit our attachment style? So getting back to the cry it out thing, it's incredibly difficult to describe how to parent or the parenting experience, and in a variety of levels, this one included, among maybe millions of different topics that we could get into. But the topic of when and if and how do you transition the kid out of your bed or room into their own room or something, Now, and there's plenty of cultures where everyone sleeps in the same room for their entire life. And there's nothing wrong with that. So we just have to understand now, typical American society, then that would be an atrocity on a number of levels. But anyway, so when it comes to that decision or that process or that experience for the kid and the parent, it's too varied and it's too dependent on minute-to-minute decisions that people make. What I will do with parents is that I will ask them what they want to do, because sometimes what they say they want isn't what they want. They think they should because of society. So I want to free them from the nonsense of that and give them the science and that sort of thing. And then now they still might, move forward with their plan. And there's various reasons to do that, right? Your sex life, one might be one of the things. There's ways around that, afternoon sex, this kind of stuff, But if they choose to do that, then we start going down that road. But one of the many factors that we pay attention to is, how does the kid react? If the kid seems fine, or with minimal adjustment period, the kid's like, okay, it's bedtime, I'm sleepy, it's nap time, and you lay them down and they sort of futz with their little toy that they have with them in bed, and then they're out. And then they wake up and they cry, and you go in there, you pick them up, and they seem fine, right? But you take another kid and you put them, they start to fall asleep, they're cuddling with you, you set them down in the crib, and as soon as they notice that they're in the crib, they completely flip the fuck out. Well, that's a different scenario. That kid is different, or is at a different phase, or, there's just a myriad of reasons as to why that would be happy. Maybe it's temporary, maybe it's not. And so, same goes for anybody of any age. You can have a 13-year-old that, culturally speaking, seems too childish and is too clingy or whatever, and it depends is the thing. And we love to claim that our way is the way, and we love to judge other parents, and especially mothers, and there's just too many variables. But there's a lot of options. But if you understand the principles, and you don't listen to society, and you don't worry about what, some asshole says in the grocery store when you're doing your best, you're trying to parent your kids the best, and some asshole comes out and says, you're doing it wrong, and they don't know what the fuck they're talking about. If you don't listen to that, then it's hard to navigate anyway. Anyway, going on. Do we inherit our attachment style, or does environment we grow in? So one might think that genetics don't really play a role when it comes to attachment style, but it kind of does. It depends on also what age we're talking about of the kid, like, early childhood, and also how do we measure genetic influence? There's twin studies, there's problems with that. It's hard, but it seems obvious to me, and I think to others in my field, that we come into the world with a set of dispositions, maybe, millions of little tendencies. Some kids are more excitable, some kids are more sensitive, some kids sleep easier, some kids are more sort of steady state, mellow. Some kids are more seeking of novelty, some kids want danger, some kids are afraid more than, there's just a lot of, the way that I visually think about it is just like we have a lot of dials, and we come into the world with the dials set at a certain level. Like our fear is at a 5, and our creativity urges are at a 7, and our sleep stability is at a 2 or whatever, and those dials get affected by all the things that we experience socially, and parenting, and attachment, and interpretation of our own lives, and biology, and neural development, and everything, and trauma, and whatever. And so those dials get shifted, but at any given time, those are where the dials are, and that has everything to do with genetics and epigenetics in the womb. Okay, and those things will interact. We aren't blank slates entering the world. I think anyone that's been around young kids knows that. As soon as they have the ability to express any sort of individuality, which is pretty quickly in life, you see things that are like, oh, that's different, or I wonder if that'll grow into something, and it often will, right? So it stands to reason that part of our so if we just kind of reduce it to like part of our personality, our tendencies, our reactivity, the way we interpret things, our neurology is genetic, right? And there's some variability there among all the infants that are born, and that is determined largely by the combination of the genetics between the parents, but also epigenetics in the womb, blah blah blah. And then we say, then we have that child. And so we have a variety of dispositions that enter into the world. And let's just say, for the sake of argument, that all those kids are parented in the exact same way, which is ridiculous. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that that's what happens. Well, you're going to have different results. All kids, same environment. That's impossible to engineer, but let's say thought experiment. Okay, I think most of us would intuit, well, there would be differences, right? If all the kids are raised in a secure attachment, there would be a really high rate of secure attached adults, right? But there would be some that wouldn't. And that only explains part of the personality, the attachment style, right? There's a lot of other aspects. So when it comes to measuring this, and we have we have no ability to establish causation, or it's really hard. But when we look at at the data, it seems to suggest that parenting has plays a big role in shaping the attachment style of the young child, and that genetics might play a minimal role. But for people that are older, it's possible that the genetics will eventually play a role. So does that mean that that puberty sort of kicks in and then our disposition starts to accentuate or influence, or and maybe we evolved as creatures to be more adaptable when we're an infant to our scenario, but as a teenager we start to gravitate towards our more central tendencies, you know what I mean, that we were quote unquote programmed or born to be, or it's unknown. It's also possible that the way in which we measure attachment style in infancy is this very rudimentary, reductive way of looking at things, and the behaviors that we can even look at in children are extremely rudimentary. You know, it's like a child that runs to their parent or not, or cries or not, or plays with toys or not. Whereas when we're talking about teenagers and adults, there's like so many different ways to express behavior and personality. You know, it's complicated. But the notion of inheritance and genetic factors is intuitive to me, that they play a role. We don't have any fucking way to measure it. It's not like you can take a genetic test of a child and know what's going to happen. And for some people, they'll be like, well, it doesn't matter how you parent your kid, because it's just genetics, and that's nonsense. It's not even reflective of the science. Going on, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. I think that's also genetics. Avoidantly attached people aren't selfish, uncaring, and uninterested in relationships. Yeah, you hear me talk about this all the time, that people will think that avoidant attached people are uncaring or cold, but that's just them masking. Going on, do timeouts really hurt children or damage children? So as with transitioning kids to their own room or their own crib, the timeout way of managing kids' behavior, shaping kids' behavior, is too variable. Do you have to use timeouts to raise good kids? No. Can you use timeouts in a way that would harm a kid? Maybe. Can you use timeouts in a way that would help a kid? Yeah. It's too variable. When we reduce parenting to these practices, I would just hope that any parent out there would know that there's too many variables. Like you use timeouts for yourself. Well, even just in the same family, like you yourself do timeouts in a certain way, but your spouse does timeouts in a different way. And let's say both of your ways are fine, but they're different, with different vibes, different thresholds, different time lengths, different approaches, different ways of transitioning them out of timeout. It's too variable, and every kid's different. Some kids flip the fuck out with timeouts. Other kids they think it's the best thing ever because they don't have to interact with their siblings anymore. Oh, I got to go in my room by myself and read my book. Thank you. I'll take that. So there's too many variables, and the evaluation needs to be case by case, and we also need to understand all the theory and blah, blah. What is attachment trauma? What is attachment trauma? Yeah, I won't go into that. Meaning that, the word trauma needs to be defined, and maybe I'll do a deep dive on that some. Can I really inherit my mother and grandmother's trauma? Right. So people will think of intergenerational or transgenerational trauma as like supernatural or something. But the theory goes, and it's hard to even know if this is really happening, but it stands to reason that, the way that grandma experienced life and the way that she ended up parenting her kids because of the way she experienced life, good or bad, affected her kids, right? Those kids grow up. One of them has you as a kid, and those attachment styles or experiences or lessons or ways of seeing the world, seeing the self, will get transmitted the way that language gets it's likely you speak a very similar language as your grandparents do. I do, depending on immigration and whatnot. All my grandparents spoke English. And so they spoke English to their kids, and those kids spoke English to me. So it stands to reason that a lot of things would be transmitted, some things obvious like language or accent, and other things a lot more subtle, like working models of self and other going on. Are claims about attachment more credible if combined with neuroscience explanation? And then Dr. Pascal says, nope. More often than not, the result is neurobullocks. So it's a UK kind of thing. Yeah, so I won't read the body of this explanation, but I understand what he's getting at, which is that, and I talked about this earlier, I think, that when it comes to trying to promote or understand or sell a book or whatever, a lot of people in the last 10 or 20 years will connect attachment, life, to neuroscience. And sometimes that's done in a responsible way, and other times it's done in an irresponsible way, like with people that take polyvagal theory too far, or mirror neurons too far, or oxytocin too far. And it's, as Dr. Pascal says, it's just neurobollocks or neuro bullshit, I think. Isn't bollocks just like balls? Anyway, we can't get stuck in a certain brain or nervous system state. There aren't any such discrete physiological states. Yeah. Oh, mirror neurons. Mirror neurons, empathy and attachment, looking beyond cells that read minds. Yeah. So I'll just say blanketly in a very quick way that mirror neurons, there's some really exciting science around that, really interesting observations, some upsetting ones because they will do experiments on monkeys in the lab. They will, I won't describe it, but it's awful. It's completely inhumane and torturous to these monkeys, but they have observed certain things. But anyway, yeah, and it's interesting to have that, anyway, I won't go into the details, but people that are trying to sell a book or make you watch a TikTok video will stretch those ideas way beyond, and they've been doing that even before the internet with mirror neurons. Anyway, going on, attachment theory and Buddhism calling for non-attachment don't have anything in common, or do they? Yeah. So when we talk about, I'm not a Buddhist. I know enough about Buddhism to say the following, which is that at least I can only talk about how Buddhism is practiced in Seattle among a lot of white people. I have Buddhism in my ancestry. Japanese people tend to be Buddhists. It's in all likelihood my great-great-grandparents in Japan were Buddhists, and Shinto, it's a combination of that anyway. And what I'll say is that what a lot of Seattle white, and there's nothing wrong with being a Seattle white Buddhist, by the way, I'm not, but that's the contact that I have. And so they will talk about detaching or having non-attachment. What they're tending to refer to often is like attachment to material goods, or attachment to career achievement, or attachment to not conflicting with your partner, right? It's like you're too locked in, you're too rigid, and that attachment leads to suffering. And we could get into the weeds in terms of the wisdom of that point of view, because if you take it in a certain direction, it's just like, well, why are you alive if you're not attached to something, And I'm not the first person to talk about that, and there's different ways of practicing it. And certainly there's a lot of wisdom to evaluating your attachments. But when they're talking about attachments, they're not talking about attachment theory or bonding. Sometimes they are talking about that, but other times they're talking about attachment to other kinds of things, attachment to outcome, Anyway, now can they be related? Sure, but they're quite different. And I won't expand, even though I want to. Because there's a whole thing about the movement of Stoicism, and although there's some wisdom, there's also a lot of problems going on. The anxious avoidant trap, fact or fiction? Yeah, okay. I think I'll stop there. They talk about human-pet attachment. Is that a real thing? Of course it is. Yes, there are sex differences in attachment, but they are more complex. Oh, I see what this anxious attachment trap is about. So you'll see online content that will say that this combo between preoccupied women and avoidant, dismissive men is doomed, or something like this. And it's not. It can be a very difficult scenario and can lead to a lot of common problems. but it's certainly people aren't doomed. And with enough self-awareness or just coming together in a way that balances each other out, there's just a lot of things we can say. And we've done a lot of research on this, and the preoccupied woman in a heterosexual relationship with an avoidant, dismissive man is something that is culturally very fitting to us, because women are, not only encouraged, but also seen as more preoccupied. When it can be hard for people to imagine an avoidant woman or a preoccupied man. But research shows, and I'll tell you from anecdotal experience, that they're out there. In fact, for myself, I don't think of gender when I think of preoccupied or avoidant or any of the attachment styles. When I envision an avoidant person, when I recall avoidant people, people of all genders come to mind, and it's true for any of the attachment styles. So I think it's kind of getting into that in terms of the way that we tend to talk about this. But so I think that's good for now. But I want to thank Dr. Pascal Vrticka, Associate Professor in Psychology at the University of Essex, United Kingdom, website pvrticka.com, for providing this. And if you want to go there, there's a lot. I barely read any of it. There's all these hyperlinks to research, and it's a pretty good page, and I'm guessing that this whole website is pretty good, but you can go there for that if you want. And everyone out there, please take care of yourself, because you deserve it. You really, really do.